This video will cover how you can get this incredible Great Katana Samurai build, going in about 5 minutes after starting the DLC. We'll be covering the weapon and Ash of War locations, and also every spell, talisman and possible armor sets you might need for this build. And most importantly, we'll cover how you can upgrade this build as you progress the game, going from beginner to mid to end game, then finally to the DLC build. So yes, this video is for you, dear player, whether you're new to the game or a veteran. There will be no spoilers on any major DLC bosses or story elements. I will only be showing off this build on basic field enemies from the start of the DLC and some late game enemies from the base game. Let's start with the DLC build and make our way backwards to the beginner version. The Great Katana is part of a new weapon class introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree. This weapon requires some strength and dexterity to use, and it's much longer and does more damage than a typical katana. Its moveset is what you'd expect from a katana. The running light attack and follow-up has some pretty good reach, and the running R2 attack is a horizontal slash that could be used to hit multiple enemies at the same time. But where this weapon shines is its weapon skill, which is overhead stance. While it's not as strong as another Ash of War that you can find early game, which we'll talk about later, overhead stance is completely unique to Great Katanas, and a normal attack from this stance is a step forward and a slash downwards, or use a strong attack to deliver a series of 3 downward slashes while stepping forwards. The Great Katana also sets bleeding as a status effect build-up, which is also pretty great. In fact, I have the weapon on Occult Affinity because it scales really well on Arcane. And Arcane would increase your bleed build-up immensely. This is great if you previously used Rivers of Blood, since you won't need to change your attributes much. Even though Keen Affinity will increase your attack power by about 40, with Arcane scaling your blood loss build-up will be double what it is by default, so you're going to get a lot more bleed triggers if you go with the Occult route. However, if using Bloodflame Blade is important to you, remember you cannot use it with Occult Affinity, in which case you might want to go with Keen. The other Ash of War that you might want to give a try is the Savage Lion's Claw. This is an upgraded version of the Lion's Claw from the base game, allowing you to do 1 additional somersault when you hit L2 twice. It's really good at dealing damage and stance damage, and overall you'll find it more effective than overhead stance. However, it costs quite a bit of FP to use. But hopefully at this point in the game you would have enough FP to manage using Savage Lion's Claw. Now, as for the locations of Savage Lion's Claw and the Great Katana, you can get both within 5 minutes of starting the DLC. You just have to take this path. Starting from the 3-path cross site of Grace, all you have to do is head north. Here, stick to this wall on your left side, and follow the wall towards the north. You'll eventually come across a small camp, where you'll just find the Ash of War lying on the ground. Now keep heading north towards this lake. Here you'll find the sleeping Ghost Flame Dragon. Attack it and it'll start to move away. You don't need to fight the dragon. Underneath where it was sleeping, you'll find the Great Katana. Once you have the sword, you can just run away. There's a site of grace just east of this lake. Now moving on to the armor. I always love going for a samurai cosplay, using the White Reed set, or even the Ronin set. This of course comes down to whether you prioritize fashion over function, but it basically comes down to making sure you have 51 poise. Having 51 poise will make sure you will be able to play more aggressively without being interrupted. If you don't have 51 poise, we can fix that using a talisman, which brings us neatly into the talismans used for this build. Generally, a great talisman for these builds is the Shard of Alexander, which will increase the damage of your skills by 15%, and it can help increase the damage of Overhead Stance or Savage Lion's Claw. I'm also using the Green Turtle Talisman to be able to recover stamina 17% faster. And finally, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to reduce physical damage taken by 20%, and the Bull Goat's Talisman to raise your poise by 33%. These 2 talismans are great since the DLC enemies hit like a truck, and this leads back to being able to hit enemies without being interrupted, So both these talismans allow you to survive while dealing back incredible damage. An alternative to using Bullgoat's talisman if you don't need it would be either the Rotten-Winged Insignia or Milicent's Prosthesis, which would both increase your attack power by a percentage for every successive hit you deal, which would be quite often with this build. And an alternative to the Dragon Crest talisman if you don't need it would be the Carrion Filigreed Crest, which will lower the FP cost of skills by 25%. This might be useful with Savage Lion's Claw and its larger FP cost. Now these talismans are quite similar to the level 150 Rivers of Blood build, which I used to enter the DLC with. This Rivers of Blood build will carry you through the endgame or even the DLC with absolutely no problem, especially with the talisman combination we've got going. With this weapon, your primary attack will be your skill, Corpse Piler. Corpse Piler has extremely long range and does bleed and fire damage. Rivers of Blood mainly scales on Dex and Arcane. The interesting thing about the scaling on this weapon is, even though Arcane is scaled on D, you'll still come out ahead on damage, and as a bonus, Arcane will increase your blood loss buildup, which means you'll bleed enemies even faster. And this is what's so great about the Great Katana on the Occult affinity. You basically don't need to change anything about your attributes to be able to use the Great Katana and still be deadly with it, as it would also scale with Arcane. We're still using the green turtle for stamina, plus either of the two winged sword insignias, or even Milicent's Prosthesis. That combined with the Shard of Alexander would increase the damage of Corpse Piler by 15%, which stacks with the additional damage percentage for every successive hit you deal. This makes Corpse Piler very, very deadly. You can also use the Carrion Filigreed Crest, which will lower the FP cost of Corpse Piler by 25%. And of course, a must-have talisman would be the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, which raises attack power by 20% for 20 seconds when blood loss occurs in the vicinity, combined with the White Mask, which will increase your attack power by 10% for 20 seconds if something around you suffers from blood loss. This all adds up to a 30% attack power increase. And we're using Rivers of Blood, we're going to be activating this buff very, very often. You can also use the Okina Mask, which increases your dex by +3, which might be more suitable for a samurai cosplay. This Rivers of Blood build will 100% be able to carry you through the endgame and even the DLC. But if you're new to the game and still in the early stages, here's an easy Bloodflame build to get you started. You could use this to transition into the Rivers of Blood later on, when you're able to obtain the weapon. We're going to be using the Nagakiba for this beginner build, because it has some incredible reach, it looks sick, and you can get it 5 minutes after starting a new game. The Nagakiba scales with both strength and dexterity, so you'll want to boost those stats for maximum damage. Focus more on dexterity since it sets you up nicely for transitioning to Rivers of Blood later on, but don't forget to add a few points to strength. This helps you take advantage of the 1.5 times scaling when you two-hand the weapon. We'll also be using Double Slash as our weapon skill. Double Slash lets you hit enemies rapidly with successive attacks and allows for 2 more follow-up strikes. This pairs perfectly with Bloodflame Blade, as the fast attacks build up blood loss quickly. Double Slash is also great because it's similar to Corpse Piler from Rivers of Blood, which we'll be using later. Since this is an early game build, we'll use Radagon's Source Seal and the Green Turtle Talisman to boost our levels and stamina. The stamina recovery from the Green Turtle Talisman is crucial since Double Slash eats up a lot of stamina. So before we talk about where to find all the required items, let's quickly cover the attributes required for this build. Starting with the Bloodflame Nagakiba build, since this is a starter to mid-game build, all we're doing is hitting the base requirements to be able to use the spells and the Nagakiba. The Nagakiba mainly scales on dexterity, which will boost up to level 22, and remember, additional to that, we also have Radagon's Source Seal, which will boost some of our stats by 5. Other than that, we can bump up vigor and endurance, just so we could take some hits, and be able to use the extra stamina on Double Slash. Now moving on to the stats for the Rivers of Blood build and the Occult Great Katana build. Considering this is an endgame, level 150 build, I've got 50 vigor, 30 mind, 18 endurance, 12 strength, 48 dexterity, 9 intelligence, 15 faith, and 50 arcane. The 50 Vigor is mainly because we'll be playing a hyper-aggressive playstyle, which means we'll also probably taking a few hits. Being able to stay alive and be able to proc bleed on bosses and enemies is important. 30 Mind ensures a good FP pool for using our skills frequently. Without enough FP, you'll struggle and might need to consume your FP potions, which is not ideal. 18 Endurance gives more stamina and some equip load. Stamina is an issue with this build. You'll carry a weapon in the offhand and probably a seal, so some equip load is necessary. Medium to light armor with points in endurance helps with this. For strength, we just need to hit the minimum requirements for either Rivers of Blood, which is 12, or the Great Katana, which is 14. And between Arcane and Dexterity, 48 Dexterity gives a nice damage increase for both weapons. After that though, you won't see much of a difference leveling up Dexterity. At this point, Arcane and Dexterity are pretty much on equal levels, but Arcane might have a slight edge since it helps increase blood loss buildup, especially with the Occult Great Katana, which gets about double the bleed buildup. So, hitting 50 Arcane is perfect for maximizing damage, whether you're using spells or weapon attacks. It's a solid choice for this build no matter what weapon you go with. And if you want to go down the heavy Great Katana route with the Savage Lion's Claw, I recommend these stats, which comes down to having as many points as possible into strength, since the weapon would scale really well on strength. There's a lot more to cover for this beginner Bloodflame build, including the weapon and spell locations, so watch this video next for an uncut guide on where to find all the items in about 30 minutes of starting a new game.